Hey there, JustProfessor here. Someone offers you a bet. Flip a coin. Heads, you win $100. Tails, you lose $100. Perfect 50-50 odds. Fair bet, but you won't take it. Not because the math is bad, but because your brain values not losing that $100 way more than it values winning that $100. And this imbalance is controlling every decision you make. Losses hurt about twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. Losing $50 causes more pain than gaining $50 causes pleasure. This isn't logical. $50 is $50. But your brain doesn't work that way. It treats losses and gains asymmetrically. The pain of losing dominates the pleasure of winning. This is called loss aversion, and it's making you avoid good opportunities, stick with bad situations, and make decisions that protect you from losses while preventing you from making gains. Loss aversion is when you feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains. Your emotional response to losing something is stronger than your emotional response to gaining the same thing. This makes you overly focused on avoiding losses even when pursuing gains would be better overall. You choose options that minimize potential losses rather than options that maximize expected value. This happens because your brain evolved in environments where losses could be fatal. Losing resources meant potential starvation or death. Gaining resources was good, but not as urgently important as not losing what you already had. So your brain developed a strong emotional response to loss that outweighs the response to gain. This kept ancestors alive, but now makes you make irrational choices in modern contexts. The problem is loss aversion makes you too conservative. You avoid reasonable risks because the possible loss looms larger than the possible gain. You stay in bad situations because leaving means accepting a loss. You don't pursue opportunities because they involve risking what you have. The fear of loss becomes more powerful than the desire for gain, even when the math says you should take the risk. This creates a fundamental irrationality in decision-making. You should evaluate options based on expected outcomes considering both probabilities and values. But loss aversion makes you weight the loss side of the equation much more heavily than the gain side. A 50% chance of losing $100 feels worse than a 50% chance of gaining $100 feels good, even though mathematically they're equivalent. Let me show you how loss aversion controls decisions in ways you don't realize. Selling investments demonstrates this clearly. You buy a stock for $100. It drops to $80. Logically, you should evaluate whether to hold or sell based on future prospects. But loss aversion makes you hold because selling would mean accepting the $20 loss as real. As long as you don't sell, you can tell yourself the loss isn't real yet. So you hold losing investments too long, trying to avoid the pain of realizing the loss. Meanwhile, if a stock you bought for $100 goes up to $120, you're quick to sell and lock in the gain. You're not as motivated to hold winners as you are to hold losers. Loss aversion creates the opposite of good investment strategy. You should cut losses and let winners run. Instead, you hold losses and cut winners. Job decisions get distorted by loss aversion heavily. You're in a job that's okay but not great. You get an offer at another company that's objectively better. Better pay, better growth potential, better fit. But you don't take it because leaving means losing the security and familiarity of your current job. The possible loss of what you have feels bigger than the possible gain from something new, even when the new opportunity is clearly better. The same thing keeps people in bad jobs for years. They know they should leave. Better options exist. But leaving means losing what they've built, losing seniority, losing comfortable routines. Loss aversion makes the certain small loss feel worse than the uncertain large gain, so they stay stuck. Relationships show loss aversion effects in sad ways. You're in a relationship that isn't working. You know you should end it, but ending it means losing the time invested, losing the shared history, losing the relationship identity. These losses feel enormous even when staying means missing out on better relationships or better times alone. Loss aversion keeps people in wrong relationships far longer than they should stay. The pain of the definite loss from breaking up overwhelms the uncertain gain from being free to find something better. People endure years of unhappiness trying to avoid the sharp pain of accepting the relationship loss. Consumer behavior is heavily influenced by loss aversion. Free trial periods work because once you have the service, canceling it feels like a loss even though you never paid for it. You frame the decision as losing the service rather than choosing not to pay. Loss aversion makes you more likely to continue paying to avoid the loss feeling. Return policies reduce loss aversion and increase purchases. If you can return something, buying it doesn't feel like a committed loss. This makes you willing to take the risk of purchasing. Companies know loss aversion makes people reluctant to buy, so they reduce the sense of permanent loss through returns. Pricing strategies exploit loss aversion constantly. Don't miss out and limited time. Messaging triggers loss aversion. You're not thinking about gaining a product. You're thinking about losing an opportunity. The framing shifts from evaluating gain to avoiding loss, which motivates action more strongly because loss aversion makes that feel more urgent. Negotiations reveal loss aversion dynamics. People fight harder to avoid giving up something they have than to gain something of equal value they don't have. If you're negotiating from a position where you're defending existing terms, loss aversion gives you more motivation than the other side who's trying to gain better terms. The emotions aren't balanced even though the stakes are equivalent. Insurance purchases are driven by loss aversion. You're paying certain money to avoid possible larger losses. This only makes sense if the losses would be catastrophic. For small potential losses, insurance is usually bad value. But loss aversion makes people overinsure because the fear of loss is so strong that paying to avoid it feels worth it even when the math does not support it. Gambling shows loss aversion in a twisted way. People who are losing will take bigger risks to try to get back to even. They're not motivated by winning. They're motivated by avoiding ending with a loss. This leads to escalating bets and chasing losses. The pain of accepting the loss is so strong that people take worse and worse bets trying to avoid it. Project continuation demonstrates loss aversion in organizational contexts. A project is failing. More investment won't fix it. But killing the project means accepting all previous investment as a loss. Loss aversion makes people continue funding bad projects because stopping means realizing the loss, while continuing keeps the illusion that it might still pay off. Home selling shows loss aversion clearly. People refuse to sell homes for less than they paid even when market value has dropped. They'll wait years holding an empty home rather than accept selling at a loss. Loss aversion makes them reference the purchase price as the key number, even though that's not relevant to current value. Change resistance comes partly from loss aversion. Any change means losing current ways of doing things. Even when the change would bring improvements, the certain loss of what exists now feels bigger than the uncertain gain from what could be. This makes individuals and organizations stick with bad systems because changing means accepting losses. So, how do you make rational decisions when loss aversion makes you overweight losses? How do you evaluate choices fairly when losing hurts more than winning feels good? First, recognize that your emotional response to losses is exaggerated compared to gains. When you feel strong resistance to an option because of a possible loss, question whether you're overweighting that loss. The pain you're anticipating is probably larger than the pain you'd actually feel. Second, evaluate decisions based on overall expected value, not loss prevention. Calculate what's likely to happen with each option, considering both gains and losses. Don't let the loss side dominate just because it feels more intense. Make yourself account for both sides proportionally. Third, reframe decisions to focus on overall outcomes rather than losses from current status. Instead of thinking about what you'd lose by making a change, think about where you'd end up with each option. This reduces the reference point bias that makes current state feel like the baseline you're losing from. Fourth, Use the "would I do this if I didn't have the current option" test. If you wouldn't choose your current situation if you were starting fresh, loss aversion is probably keeping you stuck. Make decisions as if you're choosing from scratch, not protecting what you already have. Fifth, set rules for accepting losses before emotions kick in. Decide in advance when you'll sell a losing investment or quit a failing project. When the rule triggers, follow it. Don't let loss aversion in the moment override the rational rule you set earlier. Sixth, distinguish between losses that matter and losses that only feel bad. Some losses genuinely harm your situation. Others just trigger loss aversion without real impact. Selling a stock at a loss doesn't make the loss more real. The loss happened when the price dropped. Selling just acknowledges reality. Seventh, remember that avoiding losses often means missing gains. The opportunities you don't pursue because they involve risk are real costs, even though they don't feel like losses. Loss aversion makes you undervalue what you could gain, while overvaluing what you might lose. Loss aversion is making you feel losses about twice as intensely as equivalent gains. This asymmetric emotional response distorts your decision-making. You avoid good opportunities to prevent possible losses. You stick with bad situations to avoid certain losses. You make choices that minimize loss rather than maximize overall value. Your brain is protecting you from loss at the expense of rational optimization. This isn't a minor quirk. It's a fundamental bias that affects almost every decision involving uncertainty or change. Jobs, relationships, investments, projects, purchases. All of these trigger loss aversion. In each case, your emotional system overweights potential losses and underweights potential gains, pushing you toward overly conservative choices. The real problem is loss aversion feels like wisdom. Risk aversion feels responsible. Protecting what you have feels smart. But there's a difference between reasonable caution and irrational loss aversion. Reasonable caution considers both sides fairly. Loss aversion weights one side at twice the emotional intensity of the other, creating systematic bias toward staying put even when moving forward is better. Understanding loss aversion doesn't eliminate it. You'll still feel losses more than gains. That's built into how your brain works. But awareness lets you recognize when the feeling is misleading. You can catch yourself avoiding good options because of exaggerated loss fears. You can force yourself to evaluate both sides proportionally instead of letting loss dominate. The next time you're avoiding a decision because you might lose something, stop and check if you're experiencing loss aversion. Is the loss really as bad as it feels? Would the potential gain be worth it if you weighed both sides fairly? Are you making this choice to maximize your outcome or just to avoid the pain of loss? Most people never ask these questions. They let loss aversion control their decisions while thinking they're being rationally cautious. Your brain evolved to keep you alive by avoiding losses. That made sense when losses meant starvation. It makes less sense when losses are temporary setbacks, and avoiding them means missing opportunities for significant gains. Learning to override loss aversion when it's leading you wrong is one of the most valuable decision-making skills you can develop. Subscribe to learn more about the emotional biases that control your choices while feeling like rational thinking.